Get out and let's see how tough you feel when you have no way to get home. Sarah laughed, her voice cutting through the crisp mountain air like a blade. Michael gunned the rental car engine, gravel spraying from the tires as they disappeared down the winding country road, leaving me standing alone with my suitcase on a patch of grass that barely qualified as a town square. That's when I realized my own daughter had just declared war on me. Now let me back up and tell you exactly how a 67-year-old American grandmother ended up stranded in the middle of nowhere, in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Because, trust me, it wasn't on any travel brochure I'd ever seen. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had called me with what she claimed was exciting news. "Mum, Michael's company is sending him to Asheville for a conference, and we thought it would be wonderful if you joined us for a little family vacation afterward." I should have known something was off when she used the word wonderful. Sarah hadn't found anything about me wonderful since her teenage years, but like the fool I apparently was, I'd gotten excited. When was the last time my daughter had invited me anywhere? When was the last time she'd wanted to spend time with me that didn't involve babysitting her kids or lending her money? So, I'd booked my flight, packed my best clothes, and even bought a new camera to document our wonderful family trip. The trouble started the moment I met them at Asheville Airport. Sarah took one look at my outfit, a perfectly respectable pantsuit I'd bought specifically for the trip, and rolled her eyes so hard I'm surprised they didn't fall out. "Really, Mom? You're going to dress like a librarian the entire time we're here?" Michael, ever the charmer, had smirked from behind his phone. At least she matches the scenery. All those old craft shops and museums. I'd bitten my tongue, determined not to let their rudeness ruin what I'd hoped would be a chance to reconnect. For 3 days, I'd followed them around Asheville like a third wheel they couldn't shake. When they wanted to eat at expensive restaurants, I'd paid without complaint. When they wanted to shop for things they couldn't afford, I'd handed over my credit card with a smile. When they'd booked us into separate hotel rooms because everyone needs their space, I'd agreed cheerfully. Yesterday morning, Michael had announced we were taking a scenic drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains. "You'll love it, Eleanor," he'd said, using my full name the way he always did when he was being condescending. Very authentic mountain experience. The drive had been beautiful. I'll give him that. Rolling hills covered in autumn colors, ancient stone bridges crossing streams that sparkled in the September sunlight. For a moment, sitting in the back seat of their rental car, I'd actually felt grateful to be there with them. That was before Sarah turned around with that familiar expression of barely controlled irritation. "Mum, can you please stop taking pictures of every barn and covered bridge we pass? You're making the whole car shake." "I'm documenting our trip," I'd said mildly. "For what? Your Instagram account that doesn't exist?" Michael had laughed at his own joke. "For my memory," I said. "I want to remember this time with you." That's when Sarah's expression had changed, hardening into something I didn't recognize. "Our time together, right?" She'd exchanged a look with Michael that made my stomach clench. "Actually, Mom, there's something we need to talk to you about." And that's how I'd learned. Somewhere between a century-old gristmill and this god-forsaken town called Cedar Creek that probably had more cows than people, that I was apparently a burden they could no longer carry. "We've been patient with you for years," Sarah had said, her voice rising with each word. "But you're suffocating us. You're always there, always wanting to be included, always acting like we owe you something just because you're our mother." Now here I stood, watching their taillights disappear around a bend in the road with exactly $50 in my wallet, a dead cell phone, and the sinking realization that my own daughter had just abandoned me in a remote part of the country like an unwanted pet. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same daughter I'd raised alone after her father walked out when she was 12. The silence after their car disappeared was absolute. No traffic, no voices, just wind whistling through what looked like the remains of an old general store and the distant lowing of cows. I stood there for a full minute, suitcase handle gripping tight in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. My first coherent thought was remarkably practical. I needed to find a phone. The second thought was less helpful. What kind of mother raises a daughter capable of this level of cruelty? But standing here feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to get me back to civilization. So I picked up my suitcase and started walking toward what appeared to be the town center. And I use the term center loosely. We're talking about maybe 6 buildings clustered around what might charitably be called a main street. The first building looked like it hadn't been occupied since the Civil War. The second appeared to be someone's house, but the windows were dark and there were no signs of life. The third building had a faded sign hanging askew that read, Cedar Creek General Store, but when I tried the door, it was locked tight. Wonderful, I muttered, and immediately heard Sarah's voice in my head, mocking my word choice, even abandoned in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I couldn't escape my daughter's criticism. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of music coming from somewhere up the street, real music with actual instruments, not some ghostly mountain banjo echoing across the hills. I followed the sound like a beacon, dragging my suitcase behind me over cobblestones that had probably been there since before the Civil War. The music led me to a building that looked marginally more alive than the others. A wooden sign creaked in the wind. The Mountain View Inn and Tavern. Through windows that could have used a good cleaning, I could see warm light and the silhouettes of people inside. I stood outside that door for longer than I care to admit, trying to gather the courage to go inside. What was I going to say? Excuse me, but my daughter just dumped me here like a bag of garbage and I need to use your phone. It sounded pathetic, even in my head. But standing in the mountain wind wasn't going to improve my situation. So, I pushed open that heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The conversation stopped the moment I appeared, not gradually, not politely. It just died like someone had hit a mute button on the entire room. 6 or 7 people, all locals by the look of them, turned to stare at the American woman with the suitcase who just interrupted their evening. Evening, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wonder if I might use your phone. I seem to find myself in a bit of a situation. A woman behind the bar, probably in her 50s with greying hair and kind eyes, stepped forward. American, are ye? Her accent was thick but warm. What brings you to Cedar Creek with a suitcase at this hour? And that's when the absurdity of my situation hit me full force. I started laughing, not happy laughter, the slightly hysterical kind that bubbles up when your life becomes so ridiculous you can't process it normally. My daughter, I managed between gasps, just left me here because apparently I'm a burden she can no longer carry. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Then the woman behind the bar, her name was Maggie, I learned later, said something that surprised me. Well then, she's a right fool, isn't she? Come on, sit yourself down and tell us what happened. For the next hour, over a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead, I told my story to a group of mountain strangers who listened without judgment. They asked practical questions. Did I have money for a hotel? Could I get to Asheville on my own? Did I want them to call the police? That last question gave me pause. Did I want to call the police on my own daughter? The thought was tempting in the darkest corners of my mind. But what would that accomplish besides adding humiliation to abandonment? No police, I said finally. But I would appreciate directions to the nearest town with a hotel. That's when Maggie delivered the news that made my situation go from bad to worse. The nearest proper hotel is in Hendersonville, about 40 miles south. But there's no bus service here, and the taxi would cost you more than you likely have. She was right. $50 wouldn't cover a taxi to the next village, let alone a hotel room and meals, while I figured out how to get home. However, Maggie continued, and I heard hope creeping into her voice, we do have a room upstairs that we rent out sometimes. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and warm. $20 for the night, breakfast included. I wanted to hug this woman. $20 I could afford, and it would give me time to think, to plan, to figure out how to get out of this mess with whatever dignity I had left. As I climbed those narrow stairs behind Maggie, suitcase bumping against the worn wooden banister, I caught a glimpse of myself in an old mirror hanging in the hallway. My hair was disheveled from the wind, my carefully planned outfit wrinkled from travel, and my eyes looked shell-shocked. But underneath the shock, something else was stirring, something that felt surprisingly like determination. Sarah thought she could dump me here and break me. She was about to learn that her mother was tougher than she remembered. The room above the Mountain View Inn was exactly as Maggie had described. Nothing fancy, but clean and warm. A single bed with a thick quilt, a wash basin with running water, and a small window that looked out over the town square where I'd been abandoned just hours earlier. I sat on that bed and made a list in my head of everything I needed to do. Find a way to charge my phone, contact my bank to access more money, book transportation back to Asheville, and somehow get home to Ohio. Simple enough in theory. In practice, it felt overwhelming. The phone charging turned out to be easy enough. Maggie had a charger behind the bar. While it powered up, she served me a dinner that I hadn't ordered, but desperately needed: thick vegetable soup, fresh cornbread, and a glass of sweet tea that loosened the knot in my chest. "So," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "what's your plan then?" "Survive until I can get home," I said honestly, "and try to figure out how my relationship with my daughter became so broken that she could do something like this." Maggie nodded thoughtfully. "Families are complicated things. I've got a son in Raleigh who thinks I'm too old to run this place by myself. Keeps sending me brochures for retirement communities." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. As if 20 years of running an inn has suddenly made me incompetent overnight. "Children," I said, raising my glass, "apparently think they know what's best for us." "Apparently," she agreed, clinking her glass against mine. That's when my phone finally came back to life, buzzing with a dozen missed calls and twice as many text messages. My heart jumped. Maybe Sarah had realized what she'd done. Maybe she was coming back. Maybe this nightmare was over. But when I scrolled through the messages, my hope curdled into something much darker. They weren't from Sarah at all. They were from my bank. "Unusual account activity. Please confirm these transactions. Your debit card has been declined." My hands started shaking as I called the customer service number. After 10 minutes on hold and another 10 minutes of verification questions, I learned the truth. Sarah had been making charges on my account all week. Hotel rooms, meals, shopping trips, even a spa day yesterday while I thought she was visiting a museum. But the real shock came when I asked about my savings account balance. The account that should have had nearly $60,000 had less than $800. "Ma'am, you authorized these transfers to your daughter's account 3 months ago," the customer service representative explained patiently. "We have the signed documents in our files." Signed documents I'd never seen, let alone signed. Sarah had somehow gotten access to my accounts and had been systematically draining them. The abandonment in North Carolina wasn't emotional cruelty. It was the final step in what had apparently been a month-long plan to steal everything I had. I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. Maggie, who'd been politely pretending not to listen, took one look at my face and poured me another glass of sweet tea without saying a word. "It's worse than I thought," I finally managed to say. And then, because keeping it inside felt like it might kill me, I told her everything. The unauthorized transfers, the forged documents, the systematic theft that had been going on for months without my knowledge. "That's not just abandonment," Maggie said quietly when I finished. "That's elder abuse, financial abuse. It's a crime." "It's my daughter," I said, as if that somehow made it less criminal. "Makes it worse, not better," she replied firmly. "Family members who do this know exactly how much damage they're causing." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the murmur of conversation from the locals still gathered around the fireplace downstairs. Finally, Maggie spoke again. "How long can you stay here? With what money ye have left?" I did the math in my head. "Maybe a week if I'm careful." "Then we have a week to figure out how to get you back on your feet," she said matter-of-factly. "We? You think I'm going to let some American grandmother get swindled by her own child and not help? I may run an inn in the middle of nowhere, but I still have principles." The kindness from this stranger who owed me nothing was almost harder to bear than my daughter's betrayal. I hadn't cried since Sarah's car disappeared, but suddenly the tears came hard and fast. Maggie handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I fell apart. When I finally composed myself, she was still sitting there with a determined expression I was beginning to recognize. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start fighting back." I looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. "I don't even know where to begin." "Lucky for ye," Maggie smiled grimly. "I do. My late husband used to say that when someone shows ye who they really are, you better believe them. Your daughter has shown you exactly who she is. Now it's time to show her who you are." That night, lying in the narrow bed, listening to the mountain wind rattle the windows, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going home broken and defeated. I was going home stronger than I'd ever been. Sarah thought she'd destroyed me. She had no idea what she'd actually done. She'd set me free. The next morning dawned grey and misty, which seemed appropriate for my mood, until Maggie appeared at my door with a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the mountain ghosts, and a smile that suggested she'd been doing some serious thinking overnight. "Get dressed," she announced. "We have work to do." "What kind of work?" I asked, but she was already heading back downstairs, leaving me to wonder what this formidable mountain woman had planned. 20 minutes later, I found myself following Maggie down a muddy path behind the inn, through a gate I hadn't noticed yesterday, and toward what looked like an abandoned general store about the size of a small warehouse. The structure was old, probably from the early 1900s, with thick wooden walls and large display windows. But the roof looked solid, and the door was secured with a relatively modern lock. "What is this place?" I asked, as Maggie produced a large key from her coat pocket. "Used to be the town general store," she said, working the lock. "Back when this area was a thriving mountain community. My husband's grandfather bought it in the 1950s, thinking he'd convert it into something profitable. Never got around to it." The door swung open with a rusty creak, and Maggie stepped inside, gesturing for me to follow. What I saw took my breath away. The building was filled with furniture, artwork, quilts, pottery, books, and what appeared to be several decades' worth of collected mountain crafts and antiques, all covered with dust sheets and organized in rough categories throughout the space. Handmade pottery sat next to oak writing desks. Folk art paintings in simple frames leaned against walls next to collections of vintage books with leather bindings. "Good Lord," I breathed, pulling a dust sheet off what appeared to be a hand-carved wooden chest with brass fittings. "How long has all this been here?" "Decades," Maggie said, walking deeper into the store. "People would bring things here when they moved, died, downsized. My husband never had the heart to turn anyone away, and he was always convinced he'd get around to sorting through it all someday. After he died 5 years ago, I just locked the door and tried to forget about it." I ran my fingers along the surface of the wooden chest. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and despite the dust, I could see the rich grain of what looked like cherry wood underneath. "Maggie, some of this could be quite valuable." "That's what I'm hoping," she said, turning to face me with a business-like expression. "Because I have a proposition for ye." I looked up from the chest, waiting. "I need help cataloguing and researching all this," she continued. "There's probably enough here to fill an antique shop, but I don't know what's worth selling and what's worth keeping. You, on the other hand, spent 30 years as a museum coordinator back in America. Didn't you mention that last night?" I had mentioned it during one of my rambling explanations of how I'd ended up in North Carolina. Before my marriage, before Sarah, I'd worked at the Ohio History Museum, specializing in historical artifacts and their preservation. It felt like a lifetime ago. "That was a long time ago," I said carefully. "Skills like that don't expire," Maggie said firmly. "And here's my offer. You help me sort through all this, research what we've got, maybe even help me set up some sort of selling operation, and I'll split the profits with you 50-50. I stared at her. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you were abandoned by someone who should have protected you. I know you're smart enough to have managed a museum collection. I know you need money to get back on your feet. And I know I'm sitting on what could be a small fortune if we do this right." I walked deeper into the store, pulling back more dust sheets. A complete set of handmade pottery, signed by a local artist I recognized. A collection of first edition books about Appalachian history that made my museum curator heart skip a beat. A painting that looked suspiciously like it might be an early work by a well-known folk artist. This could take months, I said. Good, Maggie replied, because I've got plenty of time, and now you do too. She was right. Sarah's betrayal had inadvertently given me something I hadn't had in years. Complete freedom from family obligations. No grandchildren to babysit, no daughter to enable. No one expecting me to be the accommodating mother who never made waves. What about selling what we find? I asked. I don't know anything about the antique market here. Maggie smiled. That's where it gets interesting. My neighbour's nephew runs an auction house in Asheville. High-end stuff mostly. He's been after me for years to let him evaluate some of the pieces that have been sitting here. Never seemed worth the trouble before, but with two of us working on it. I picked up what appeared to be a small pottery vase, turning it over to look at the maker's mark on the bottom. My museum training kicked in automatically, and I felt a familiar thrill of recognition. Maggie, I said slowly, this is an original piece by the Owens family, from their early period in the 1930s. If it's authentic and in good condition, it could be worth several $100s. Her eyes widened. For that little thing? For that little thing, I confirmed. I set it down carefully and looked around the store with new eyes. If this one small piece was valuable, and it had been chosen essentially at random from hundreds of items, we're going to need better lighting, I said, and realized I was already planning our attack on this treasure trove. Is that a yes? Then I thought about Sarah, probably back in Asheville by now, assuming I was stranded and helpless. I thought about my depleted bank accounts and my uncertain future. Then I looked around this store full of possibilities and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement. It's a yes, I said, but I want a 60-40 split and I want it in writing. Maggie laughed and stuck out her hand. 60-40 and a proper contract. I knew I liked you. As we shook hands surrounded by decades of forgotten treasures, I couldn't help but smile. Sarah thought she'd left me with nothing. She'd actually left me with the first real opportunity I'd had in years to build something that belonged entirely to me. 3 weeks later, I was covered in dust. My fingernails were permanently stained, and I'd never been happier. Maggie and I had established a routine that worked like a well-oiled machine. Mornings spent carefully cataloguing items in the old general store. Afternoons researching their history and value using the surprisingly good internet connection at the Mountain View Inn. Evenings planning our next moves. The Owens family pottery had been just the beginning. We'd found a complete set of handmade quilts that were worth more than my car back home. A collection of Appalachian folk art that made my heart race when I looked up comparable pieces online. And yesterday, wrapped in what looked like old blankets at the very back of the store, we'd discovered something that made both of us stop and stare. That's not just any painting, I told Maggie, carefully examining the canvas with the magnifying glass we'd bought in town. Look at this brushwork, look at the signature in the corner. The painting was small, maybe 18 inches by 12 inches, but it was exquisite, a mountain landscape with a kind of detail and colour saturation that spoke of true artistic skill. And in the bottom right corner, partially obscured by years of grime, was a signature that made my museum curator's heart pound. E. Caldwell, I whispered. Eleanor Caldwell. But that can't be right. Why not? Maggie asked, leaning closer. Because that's my name. Well, Eleanor is my first name. But this painting looks like it's from the early 1900s. We stared at each other as the implications sank in. Could there be a connection? My family had lived in Ohio for as long as anyone could remember. I'd never heard of any relatives in North Carolina. How do we know for sure? Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We get it properly appraised, I said, already making plans. But first, we need to have it professionally cleaned and examined. That's how we'd ended up making our first trip to Asheville since I'd started my new life as an accidental antique dealer. Maggie drove us in her ancient pickup truck, the carefully wrapped painting secured in the back seat like precious cargo. The art authentication service Maggie's nephew had recommended operated out of a converted warehouse in Asheville's historic district. The expert who examined our painting was a woman about my age named Dr. Catherine Williams, with sharp eyes and gentle hands that spoke of decades of experience handling priceless artworks. "Where did you acquire this?" she asked, as she carefully unwrapped the painting and set it on her examination table. "It's been in storage for decades," Maggie explained, "part of an estate collection." Dr. Williams nodded and began her examination using tools and techniques I recognized from my museum days. After what felt like hours, she finally looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Well?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. "It's authentic," she said simply. "Early 20th century Appalachian landscape painting, probably created around 1920. The subject matter is consistent with work from that period, and the provenance makes sense. This area of North Carolina was popular with artists of that era." Maggie and I exchanged glances. "And the value?" Maggie asked. "At auction, assuming proper documentation and provenance research, I'd estimate between $15,000 and $20,000. I actually gasped. $20,000 for one small painting that had been gathering dust in a North Carolina general store. "If this is representative of what we might find in the rest of the collection," Dr. Williams continued, and my heart sank, "there's something else you should know." She pulled up a database on her computer screen and turned it toward us. "I ran the painting through our record system, and there's a notation here from 1987. This piece was reported as part of a collection that went missing from the Blackwood estate when the family lost their property to creditors." My stomach dropped. "Missing as in stolen?" "Not necessarily stolen," Dr. Williams said carefully. "More likely sold privately to settle debts, but without proper documentation of the sale. It's not uncommon with estate collections from that era. Families in financial trouble often sold pieces quietly to avoid public scrutiny." "So, we can't sell it?" Maggie asked, the disappointment clear in her voice. "You can, but you'd need to do more research first. Find documentation of how the piece came to be in your store, establish a clear chain of ownership. It's doable, but it takes time and potentially some legal assistance." As we drove back to Cedar Creek, the painting secured once again in the back seat, I found myself thinking not about the potential complications, but about the possibilities. If we had one authentic Eleanor Caldwell painting, what else might be hidden in that store? And more importantly, I was discovering that I had skills I'd forgotten I possessed. "You look like you're scheming," Maggie observed from the driver's seat. "I'm thinking," I corrected, "about how to research the provenance of that painting, about what other treasures might be waiting for us, and about how your general store is about to become the most organized antique collection in North Carolina." "Sounds like scheming to me," she said with a grin. That evening, as I sat in my little room above the inn with my laptop researching estate sales and auction records from the 1980s, I caught myself smiling. For the first time since my husband died 2 years ago, I felt useful, more than useful. I felt necessary. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment my heart jumped. Maybe Sarah had finally realized what she'd done. Maybe she was ready to apologize, to make things right. But the message wasn't from Sarah. It was from my sister Linda back in Ohio. "Haven't heard from you since your North Carolina trip. How are you doing? Call me." I looked at that message for a long time before typing back. "I'm doing better than I have in years. I'll call you soon with news." Because I was beginning to suspect that Sarah's betrayal, painful as it had been, might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. I was about to find out just how right I was. The breakthrough came exactly 6 weeks after I'd been abandoned in Cedar Creek. And it came from the most unexpected source imaginable. I was knee-deep in research about North Carolina estate sales from the 1980s when Maggie knocked on my door with the expression that I'd learned meant she had news. "There's someone downstairs who wants to meet you," she said. Says he knew your family. My family? I hadn't mentioned having any family connections to North Carolina, mostly because I hadn't thought I had any. My grandparents had immigrated to Ohio from somewhere in Europe, but the family stories had always been vague, and with both parents long dead, I'd never pursued the genealogy research. The man waiting in the inn's small sitting room was probably in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He stood when I entered, extending a hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm James Blackwood. I believe we may be related." Blackwood, the same name Dr. Williams had mentioned in connection with the missing painting. This couldn't be a coincidence. "Please sit," I said, trying to keep the suspicion out of my voice. "How did you know to find me here?" "Word travels fast in the mountains," he said with a chuckle, especially when an American woman starts poking around in old estate records and asking questions about missing artwork. My lawyer in Asheville mentioned that someone was researching the 1987 auction of my father's collection. My blood ran cold. If this man was connected to the Blackwood estate, and if our painting had been part of that collection— "I see from your expression that you know what I'm talking about," James continued gently. "The Eleanor Caldwell landscape specifically." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Well, I have some news that might surprise ye. That painting was never stolen, and it was never lost." He pulled a manila folder from his jacket and set it on the table between us. "It was painted by your great-grandmother, Eleanor Caldwell Blackwood, in 1921, when she left these mountains." The world tilted sideways. "My great-grandmother?" "Eleanor Caldwell," he said, opening the folder to reveal old documents and photographs. "My great-aunt. She married a businessman from Ohio named William Henderson, who was visiting North Carolina on business. When they left for Ohio, my great-grandfather gave her several family pieces as a dowry, including some of her own paintings." I stared at the documents he was showing me. Immigration records, marriage certificates, and most importantly, a detailed inventory of items given to Eleanor Caldwell upon her marriage, signed and witnessed in 1921. "But how did it end up in the store here?" I asked, my head spinning. James smiled sadly. "Eleanor came back to North Carolina in 1949 after her husband died. She was in poor health and didn't have any children yet. That came later with her second marriage. She stayed with our family for several months, but she was too ill to travel back to Ohio with all her possessions. So, she left them in our care with instructions to hold them until she could return for them." "And she never came back?" "She did actually in 1952 with her new husband and a baby daughter, your grandmother. But by then, she was happy in her new life in Ohio, and she told my grandfather to keep the items or do with them as he saw fit. He stored them in various places around the property. I was having trouble processing this information. So the painting belonged to my family all along." "More than that," James said, pulling out another document. "According to North Carolina inheritance law, and given that you're Eleanor's direct descendant and the only surviving member of that family line, everything she left behind legally belongs to you." "Everything?" "The painting is just the beginning. There were jewelry pieces, quilts, several other artworks, and some family documents that your great-grandmother thought might be of interest to her descendants someday." My hands were shaking as I reached for the inventory list. The items James was describing weren't just valuable, they represented a family history I'd never known existed. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "You could have kept quiet and let me continue thinking the painting was stolen." James's expression grew serious. "Because I'm dying, Mrs. Henderson. Cancer. And I've been researching our family genealogy, trying to tie up loose ends. When I discovered you existed and that you were here in North Carolina, it seemed like Providence." We spent the next 3 hours going through documents, photographs, and family stories. By the time James left, I had legal documentation proving my ownership of not just the Eleanor Caldwell painting, but of a collection of Appalachian artifacts worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. That evening, Maggie and I sat in the inn after closing time, surrounded by the documents James had left with me. "Well," she said finally, "this changes things considerably." "It does," I agreed. "The question is, what do we do now?" "Now," Maggie said with a grin, "we stop being small-time antique dealers and start being serious collectors. Because if you own a legitimate collection of this caliber, we're not talking about local auction houses anymore. We're talking about Sotheby's." I looked at the inventory list again, still hardly believing it was real. 6 weeks ago, Sarah had abandoned me here, thinking she'd left me with nothing. Instead, she'd inadvertently led me to a family legacy I never knew existed. My phone buzzed with another text from Linda. "Eleanor, I'm worried about you. Please call me." This time I picked up the phone and dialed her number immediately. "Linda," I said when she answered, "you're never going to believe what I have to tell you." Because I was about to become a very wealthy woman, and Sarah was going to discover that abandoning me in North Carolina had been the biggest mistake of her life. But first, I had some serious business to conduct. The first auction at Sotheby's Asheville was scheduled for December 15th. Exactly 4 months after Sarah had dumped me on that North Carolina roadside. As I stood in the elegant auction house, watching wealthy collectors examine my great-grandmother's landscape painting, I couldn't help but think about the irony of it all. The woman Sarah had abandoned as a worthless burden was about to become rather wealthy. Lot 47, Eleanor Caldwell, Blue Ridge Mountain Landscape. Oil on canvas, circa 1920, the auctioneer announced. Bidding starts at $8,000. My heart hammered as hands went up around the room. 8 became 12. 12 became 16. 16 became 22. Maggie squeezed my arm when the bidding hit $25,000, but it wasn't over yet. $30,000, called a voice from the back of the room. $35,000 to the gentleman in the front row. $40,000. When the hammer finally fell at $47,000, I had to sit down. One small painting that had been gathering dust in a North Carolina general store had just sold for more money than I'd made in 2 years at my old job. And it was just the beginning. Over the next 6 weeks, we sold 12 pieces from my inherited collection. The handmade quilts brought in $25,000. A collection of Appalachian folk art fetched $40,000. A set of rare books about mountain culture from the 19th century sold for $30,000 to a private collector in New York. By the end of January, my bank account showed a balance I'd never dreamed possible. More importantly, I'd discovered I had a genuine talent for this business. My museum background, combined with Maggie's local knowledge and practical sense, had created something special. "We should make this permanent," Maggie said over dinner one evening in February. "I mean, really permanent. Not just you helping me clear out the store, but a proper antique business." I looked around the Mountain View Inn, which had become more home to me than anywhere I'd lived in years. "What did you have in mind?" "Partnership. 50-50, like we agreed in the beginning. We convert part of the store into a proper showroom, maybe expand into estate sales and appraisals. I handle the local connections. You handle the research and authentication." It was exactly what I'd been hoping she'd suggest, but hadn't dared to bring up myself. "Blackwood and Henderson Antiquities has a nice ring to it." Maggie grinned. That's when my phone rang. The number on the screen made my blood freeze. Sarah. I hadn't heard from my daughter since she'd driven away and left me stranded. For 7 months she'd maintained complete radio silence, apparently content to let me disappear from her life entirely. Now, suddenly, she was calling. "Answer it," Maggie said quietly. "Time to find out what she wants." I hit the answer button with hands that weren't quite steady. "Hello, Sarah." "Mom." Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Interesting." I checked my phone logs, no missed calls from her number. "Your old number wasn't working, and nobody seemed to know where you were." I finally got this number from Aunt Linda. So Linda had given her my North Carolina phone number. "What do you want, Sarah?" "I want to apologize," she said. And for a moment, she sounded like the little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. "What Michael and I did, leaving you there, it was inexcusable." Yes, it was. We were stressed, and we'd been fighting, and we took it out on you in the worst possible way. I know that, and I know a phone call can't fix what we did. I waited, saying nothing. 7 months of silence had taught me the power of letting other people fill uncomfortable pauses. Are you still in North Carolina? She asked finally. I am. Mum, please come home. Come back to Ohio. I know we have a lot to work through, but I miss you. Michael and I both miss you. The old Eleanor might have melted at those words. The old Eleanor had spent years craving exactly this kind of acknowledgement from her daughter. But the new Eleanor, the one who'd built a successful business and a new life, recognized the manipulation in her daughter's voice. Why now, Sarah? After 7 months of complete silence, why are you suddenly calling? A pause, then, does it matter why? I'm trying to make things right. It matters to me. Another pause, longer this time. Fine. I saw something online, a news article about auction sales in North Carolina. There was a picture of you with some antique dealer, and it mentioned that you'd sold some family collection for a lot of money. And there it was. Sarah hadn't called because she missed me or felt guilty about abandoning me. She'd called because she'd learned I had money again. I see, I said quietly. Look, I know what you're thinking, but that's not why I'm calling. I mean, yes, I saw the article, but I would have called anyway. I've been planning to call for weeks. Have you, Mum, please? Can we try to fix this? I could come to North Carolina, or you could come home and we could work things out like adults. I looked across the table at Maggie, who was listening to every word with an expression of barely contained fury. Then I looked out the window at the North Carolina countryside that had become my sanctuary, my new beginning, my real home. I'm not coming back to Ohio, Sarah. But you have to. Your life is here, your friends, your house. You made me sell my house, remember? And my life is here now. The silence stretched out so long I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke again. And this time, the little girl voice was completely gone, replaced by something harder. Fine, then I'll come to you. Sarah arrived in North Carolina 3 weeks later, and she didn't come alone. She brought Michael, of course, but she also brought her 2 children, my grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, ages 8 and 12. It was a masterful manipulation, and despite everything, I had to admire the strategy. Hard to stay angry at someone when they're standing next to your grandchildren whom you haven't seen in 8 months. They found me at the old general store, which Maggie and I had converted into a proper showroom and appraisal center. The transformation had been dramatic. What had once been a dusty storage space was now an elegant display area with proper lighting, climate control, and carefully arranged exhibits of the finest pieces from local estate sales. I was photographing a collection of handmade pottery when I heard the rental car pull up outside. Through the window, I watched Sarah climb out of the driver's seat, looking around Cedar Creek with the same disdainful expression she'd worn the day she abandoned me. But when Emma and Tyler emerged from the back seat, my heart clenched painfully. They'd grown so much in 8 months. Emma had lost another tooth, and Tyler had shot up at least 3 inches. Grandma Eleanor, Emma shrieked, running toward the store door. I barely had time to set down my camera before she launched herself into my arms. Tyler followed more slowly with the carefully controlled enthusiasm of a 12-year-old boy trying to look cool, but I could see the genuine happiness in his eyes. I missed you so much, Emma whispered against my shoulder. I missed you too, sweetheart, I said, and meant it completely. Sarah and Michael approached more cautiously, taking in the store's transformation with obvious surprise. This is not what I expected, Sarah said finally. What did you expect? She gestured vaguely around the showroom. I don't know, something smaller, I suppose, more rustic. Maggie chose that moment to emerge from the office area, carrying a folder of appraisal documents and wearing the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. You must be Eleanor's daughter, she said, her mountain accent somehow thicker than usual. I'm Maggie Blackwood, her business partner. Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the business partner description. and I could practically see her recalculating whatever approach she'd planned to take. Business partner? Michael asked, looking around with newfound interest. What kind of business? Antiques, estate sales, appraisals, I said simply. We've been quite successful. Successful enough to afford this renovation, Sarah observed, and I heard the old familiar tone, the one that implied I was being wastefully extravagant. The renovation paid for itself, Maggie interjected smoothly. When you're dealing with high-value items, presentation matters. Our clients expect a certain level of professionalism. Clients? Michael asked, and I could see the dollar signs practically lighting up in his eyes. That's when Emma tugged on my sleeve. Grandma, can you show us around? This place looks like a museum. It does, doesn't it? I said, grateful for the distraction. Would you like to see some of the treasures we've discovered? For the next hour, I gave my grandchildren the same tour I gave to serious collectors and potential clients. Emma was fascinated by a collection of handmade dolls, while Tyler was drawn to a display of antique tools and mountain crafts. Are these real? He asked, examining a 19th century woodworking plane. Completely authentic, I confirmed. That particular piece belonged to a master craftsman who built half the houses in this county. We're selling it next month to a collector in Atlanta. For how much? Sarah asked, appearing beside us. $3,000, I said casually, watching her eyes widen. $3,000 for one old tool? For a documented piece of mountain craftsmanship with provenance dating back 150 years, I corrected. Sarah walked around the showroom with increasing amazement, stopping to examine price tags and documentation. I could see her doing mental calculations, adding up the value of everything on display. Mum, she said finally, I had no idea. This is really something. Thank you, I mean it. You've built something impressive here. The old Eleanor would have glowed under such praise from her daughter. The new Eleanor recognized a setup when she heard one. What do you want, Sarah? I asked quietly, drawing her away from where the children were playing. Can't I just be proud of my mother? You can, but that's not why you're here. She looked around the showroom again, and when she turned back to me, the mask had slipped slightly. Okay, fine. Yes, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished, but I'm also worried about you. Worried about what? About you being taken advantage of. About this woman, she gestured toward Maggie, who was showing Tyler how to properly hold the antique plane, using you for your knowledge and connections. I almost laughed. My daughter, who had systematically drained my bank accounts and then abandoned me in a remote area, was worried that someone might be using me. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked. Sarah glanced around to make sure the children weren't listening, then leaned closer. I think you should come home with us tonight. Pack up whatever's yours and come back to Ohio where your family can look out for you. My family. You, me, Michael, the kids. We made a terrible mistake, Mom, but we want to make it right. We want to take care of you properly this time. I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the audacity. Take care of me. You're 67 years old, living in a remote area with strangers. What happens if you get sick? What happens when you're too old to work? Who's going to look after you then? I'll manage, I said dryly. But you don't have to manage alone. That's what family is for. And despite everything I knew about my daughter, despite all the evidence of her selfishness and cruelty, some small part of me wanted to believe her. Some small part of me still craved her love and approval. Maybe that's why I made the mistake I was about to make. I'll think about it, I said. That evening, I agreed to have dinner with Sarah and her family at the small hotel where they were staying in the next town. It was the first time in 8 months that we'd sat around a table together, and I found myself watching my daughter carefully, looking for signs of the woman who had abandoned me. But Sarah was charming that night. She asked thoughtful questions about my business, praised the photographs I showed her of our recent auction successes, and even apologized again, more thoroughly this time. I've been seeing a therapist, she said over dessert, while the children played quietly with the hotel's courtesy tablets. about anger management and family relationships. She helped me understand that what I did to you wasn't just cruel, it was abusive. The word hung in the air between us. Sarah had never acknowledged that her behavior might qualify as abuse. It was, I agreed quietly. I know, and I know that saying sorry isn't enough. I have to show you that I've changed, that I'm working to become the daughter you deserve. She reached across the table and took my hand. Mum, I love you. I should have said that more often over the years. I should have shown it better, but I do love you, and I want us to be a real family again. The old Eleanor would have melted completely. Even the new Eleanor felt a dangerous softening around the edges. What does that look like? I asked. Being a real family again. It means we make time for each other. It means I stop taking you for granted. It means the kids get to know their grandmother properly. Emma looked up from her tablet. Are you coming home with us, Grandma Eleanor? The question was innocent, but it felt loaded with expectation. I looked around the table at these people who were my only family, who had travelled across the country to find me, who were saying all the things I'd longed to hear for years. I don't know, sweetheart, I said honestly. We could visit you here sometimes too, Tyler suggested. This place is actually pretty cool. Sarah smiled at her son's words. We could do that. Maybe we could even help with your business somehow. Michael's good with marketing and social media, aren't you, Michael? Michael nodded enthusiastically. I could set up a website for you, help you reach more customers online. This antique business has real potential, Eleanor. With the right marketing strategy, you could probably expand beyond North Carolina. For a moment, I let myself imagine it. A real reconciliation with my daughter, grandchildren who knew me and wanted to spend time with me. A family business that bridged the distance between us. It was seductive. It was everything I'd wanted. It was also probably too good to be true. But that night, back in my room above the Mountain View Inn, I found myself seriously considering Sarah's offer to come home. Maybe people really could change. Maybe my daughter had genuinely learned from her mistakes. Maybe the cruelty I'd experienced had been an aberration, not her true character. I was still debating with myself when I heard voices outside my window. The hotel where Sarah was staying was only a few hundred yards away, and sound carried clearly across the quiet town at night. I recognized Michael's voice first, then Sarah's. They were standing outside the hotel, apparently having what sounded like a serious conversation. I couldn't make out individual words, but I could hear the tone. Urgent, possibly argumentative. Curious, I opened my window slightly and leaned closer. Told you this was a waste of time, Michael was saying. She's not going to just hand over the business. She might, Sarah replied. Did you see how she reacted when Emma asked about coming home? She wants to believe we've changed. And if she doesn't believe it, then we move to Plan B. I felt my blood turn to ice. Plan B? I still think Plan B is too risky, Michael said. What if she finds out? She won't find out. And even if she does, what's she going to do about it? She's 67 years old and living in a remote area. Who's going to believe her over us? Their voices were getting fainter as they moved toward the hotel entrance, but I caught Sarah's final words. One way or another, Michael, we're not leaving North Carolina empty-handed. I closed the window and sat on my bed in the darkness, my heart pounding. Sarah hadn't come to North Carolina to reconcile with me. She'd come to steal from me again. The therapist, the apologies, the talk of being a real family. It was all an elaborate con game designed to get me to trust her long enough for her to figure out how to take what I'd built. I should have been devastated. I should have been crying. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity. All the doubt, all the hope that my daughter might have changed, evaporated in that moment. I knew exactly who Sarah was, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. The next morning, I met Sarah and her family at the general store as planned. But this time, Maggie was with me, along with James Blackwood, who had agreed to act as my legal representative. Mom, Sarah said with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. Michael and I were talking, and we think you should let us help you with the business. Michael could handle the financial side, and I could help with customer relations. We could really expand things." "That's kind of you, Sarah," I said calmly. "But I already have a business partner, and the business is doing quite well without your help." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "But we're family. Don't you want us to be part of this?" "I want you to be part of my life, Sarah. But that requires honesty, and I'm afraid you haven't been very honest with me." "What are you talking about?" "I heard you and Michael talking last night," I said quietly. "About Plan B, about not leaving North Carolina empty-handed." The color drained from Sarah's face. You were spying on us?" "I was listening to my daughter discuss how to manipulate me out of my business," I corrected. "The same way you manipulated me out of my life savings." "That's not what this is," Michael insisted, stepping forward. "Then what is it?" James asked, speaking for the first time. "Because from a legal standpoint, it sounds like attempted fraud and financial abuse of an elderly person." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in James's formal demeanor and the folder he was holding. "Who is this?" "This is James Blackwood," I said, "my distant cousin and my lawyer." "Lawyer?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "You don't need a lawyer. We're your family." "No," I said, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. "You're the people who abandoned me in a strange town and stole my money. Maggie and James are my family now." The silence that followed was thick with shock and outrage. I could see Sarah's mind racing, trying to find a way to regain control of the situation. "This is ridiculous," she finally spat, all pretense of warmth gone. "You've clearly been brainwashed by these mountain people. When we get back to Ohio, I'm having you declared mentally incompetent." I actually laughed. "You can try, Sarah. But I have documentation of everything you've done, the forged signatures, the unauthorized transfers, the abandonment. I also have a very successful business and a team of lawyers who would be delighted to make sure you never see a dime of my money." "You can't do this to me," Sarah said, her voice trembling with rage. "I'm your daughter." "And I'm your mother," I replied softly. "A mother who loved you enough to let you go when you clearly didn't want me in your life. A mother who has found happiness and purpose without you. And a mother who is finally strong enough to say no more." As Sarah and Michael gathered their confused children and left, I felt not sadness, but relief. The weight of my daughter's expectations, her manipulation, her contempt. It was all gone. In its place was something new and fragile. Hope. Maggie slipped her arm through mine as we watched their car disappear down the road. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm better than okay," I said, turning to face my new life, my new family, my new beginning in the Blue Ridge Mountains. "I'm free." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more interesting stories.